10. The Final Sleep. If traversing the stomach had been a test in fortitude, traversing the vein was an exercise in sanity. Though the exact height of the ceiling varied, it never grew much taller than 5 feet, forcing them all to move along with backs bent and legs straining. Soraya, tall as he was and injured as he must have felt, seemed particularly strained, though he never once broke down and mentioned it to his companions. The close walls made it near impossible for Stan or Soraya to see around Luther from the rear, and thus they would constantly ask him for reports of what awaited them ahead. Other than slight dips in the incline or little mineral clots that jutted up from the bed of the vein, there was never much to report. The tightness of the passage, alongside its frequent bends and plunges, meant Luther's visibility was only slightly better than their own. No matter how many times it happened in the pallid, black-streaked walls of the damp passage, the light of his beam playing off the reflective surfaces of the low blood underfoot always made Luther jolt. He kept expecting a mirror of the things from the digestive lake, some shambling horror of wavering gore, perhaps, to surge up from the low slush they wandered to take them. Though nothing had ever revealed itself, that didn't mean he could allow himself to let down his guard. The dips in the floor were often 45-degree slopes upon which clean descent was impossible. This meant they occasionally had to roll and slide down these spans of the vein network like children wandering some malefic water park. No matter how deeply one gouged the walls with a knife to slow the descent, it was never enough, and the tumbling prospective godslayers were constantly faced with the sensation of falling into endless nothingness as they prayed the passage would come to a reasonable level and allow them to stand once more. Even if only one man had to make these gambles for the others to learn from his shouted go-ahead from below that the drop was safe, it didn't ever lighten the mental load of the man chosen to risk the next slide for the good of the group. They frequently found themselves at intersections in the circulatory tunnel network as one vein came into contact with another, forcing them to choose between 2 or 4 or 7 branching routes. At first, whichever looked to be going lower was the favored choice. But as time wore on, another deciding factor emerged. Though the splashing of their feet in the constant mire of Dreamer's blood made it difficult to hear when moving, a noise emerged when the group stood still and silent. Faint as whispers echoing down a hallway, they could just make out the distant thrum of what they took to be a heartbeat in the lightless depths. A steady rhythm, so slow as to be easily missed. The blood itself trembled in time with its sonorous call, shivering against their feet in the gloom. Once they had noticed this noise, they tended to decide on the tunnel down which the echoed beating seemed loudest. The dreamer's pleading always grew louder and more fervent then, Luther noticed. Perhaps it knew why they had come to a stop and grown quiet at such crossroads, and was attempting to drown out what they took to be the thrum of its ancient onyx heart. Whatever the case, its internal speech was nauseating, and made Luther's head throb as if stricken with migraines each time the tone grew louder. Worse than all these hardships by far were the spans of vein which were still thick with blood. These needed to be drained to be safely passed by, and the process of cutting exit wounds for the blood to seep slowly out of was a blind process of groping and gashing around in the pooled ichor, searching for purchase with the knives. This task always fell to Luther, for he was the smallest and most maneuverable. The stuff somehow felt thicker and warmer when he was beneath its surface, thrashing to carve a drain in the floor of the vein, and more than once he felt tiny, wriggling organisms brush up against him in the black tangle of the surging liquid. Fortunately, as they were moving downward against the current, the languid pulses of the heart didn't pull him further into the depths to be drowned. It was there, in the blind chaos of those dives into the sludge, that the whispers were loudest. When he felt most alone, most vulnerable, the dreamer, even through the throes of its dying slumber, seemed to sense this as a shark senses blood upon the current. That is when it came with its promises of safety and forgiveness, interspersed with threats of what awaited Luther should he ignore these generous offers. Exhaustion made him pliable, he suspected, for the longer they dragged themselves through those cramped halls and the sloshing arteries of the dreamer, the less disgusted he was by the scratching of the dreamer upon the walls of his mind. As a traveler waylaid during the final steps of a long trek, he was silently and secretly desperate for it all to end, to kill or be killed, so that he might know some semblance of rest. Perhaps the long exposure to the blood itself played a role, feeding his nascent susceptibility. And yet, he could not believe the dreamer was anything but desperate, and the moment he rejoined his companions, he always found the memories of the pleading, bartering god slightly pathetic. After the drain was cut, they always needed to wait for the blood to slip from the downward tunnel below them. Once or twice during their long hours on the move, they cut wet paths with picks and knives through the soft tissue beside the veins, to circumnavigate particularly deep pools which Luther didn't dare to swim. But for the most part, the flooded spans of vein would lower on their own before a half hour had slipped away from them. It was during one of these breathless rests, while the group stared daggers at the slowly draining pool before them, that Luther realized just how bad Sariah's foot had gotten. The thing was bare, of course, and just as coated with the blood as all their feet must be within their sodden shoes. But his skin seemed to rupture and tremble with the growth of great hairy blisters, and his leg was pale as newly fallen snow where it met the ankle. Bulging black tendrils laced their way up his limb beneath the skin, and the more Luther watched them, the more he began to believe they pulsed in time with the awful soup of black lifeblood beneath them. "I'm impressed you're still walking on that," Luther managed, hiding the worry the thrumming veins dredged up from the depths to haunt him. "Like I said, I can't feel it anymore," Sariah said, waving the words away. "It's pure, aimless stubbornness more than any grit or strength. I don't have the energy for strength." His speech was the speech of a battered man on the verge of collapse. It was the first time either Luther or Stan had heard Sariah speak more than one or two words in a row for a long while, and the big man could hardly catch his breath after forming them. Still, slow as it was, he did catch his breath and give voice to another protest. "I could barely bring myself to end Sias and sacrifice, way back at the station before the climb. The enemy's been jeering about it in my head ever since we made it back into the Deadlands. Says it was all for nothing. Chants so loud I can't hear myself think. It's either that, or the bargaining. Frankly, the bargaining is the only thing keeping me up at the moment, the only reminder it's vulnerable." Stan interjected to ask whether Sias had been one of their brotherhood on the trip east, and when Sariah confirmed he had been, Stan shook his head. "It's a far different thing to kill someone you fought with than to kill an enemy," Stan told him. "Feeling that difference isn't weakness, it's what makes you more than a rabid animal. From what I've heard, the dreamer doesn't really understand the difference." Sariah managed a small nod of grateful agreement at that, but stayed silent. They all sat like that a moment, counting the inches as the flooded span of vein before them slowly lost its depth, before Luther asked Stan the question he'd been quietly yearning to ask since meeting him upon the cusp of the mouth. "And the dreamer's voice hasn't bothered you at all?" "It's loud," Stan answered. "Insistent. But bothered? Tempted? No, not at all." Stan went on to tell how he'd killed before, how he'd seen war and come home changed by it. Luther tried to work out which conflict the older man might have seen, for he looked a bit too young to have fought Vietnam and too old to have fought in the Gulf, but he supposed it didn't matter. The man's eyes grazing the reflective sheen of the pool before them with an electric focus which hadn't been there before, told him the man spoke the truth. He didn't wish to interrupt him, and let him speak into the yawning dark. "Men who've never seen or heard or smelled it write that there's no glory in war, but there is. even if it's just in what your buddies are doing to keep each other safe when things get hard. That tried and true professor's line about glory is actually true where the dreamer's concerned, though. There's none to be found there. Thrills, maybe, but no glory. You give up your ability to have brothers and friends and comrades at the door. There's no family to defend or win spoils for. Just the dreamer down here beneath the rock, waiting to be fed. The way I see it, I'd have to be a fool to accept any handout it threw my way, no matter how loud it screams. Luther almost cut in, almost apologized to Stan for questioning him after so frank an answer. But Stan pressed on, suddenly dropping his quiet demeanor and expounding there in the labyrinth, as all of them stared down death. It doesn't compare to what living in an earlier age would have been, though, Stan said. Eidolon and the others talked about the aimlessness of the modern age, and I couldn't agree more, though I'd never had the words to speak the feeling. 6 generations of my family lived in these hills before I came along, and the early comers fought every tribal war and feud and land dispute life served up to them. They survived every winter and killed every predator. Their fights weren't anything like mine, because all the world was the enemy, potentially at least. There wasn't a safe, secure base to slink back to except the homestead and the family. Every day was war, and they never flinched. That's strong, Stan finished, a grim grin sweeping his face as he did. They'd have been stout enough to kill it. I don't know if the same can be said to apply to me. Even after days in the Deadlands, what's that even weigh when you set it next to a lifetime's uncertainty? I don't even know why I came along, Luther said, his half-chuckle sounding almost exasperated. If you're too soft to kill it, I should have been too soft to even see it. Maybe it only took the Deadlands to drag it out of the both of you, Soraya chimed in, his heavy lids drooping as he fought sleep from his damp perch beside them. Maybe strength was buried in there all along, waiting to be set loose. What do I know, though? I'm still an initiate. Stan rallied them to their feet soon after, the moment the blood had sunk low enough for them to pass with only their waists beneath the surface. They shimmied along uncomfortably, often holding aloft the drooping ceiling of the newly drained tunnel to pass without having to submerge in the vile murk. The chemical stink filling their nostrils and the dreamer's malicious echoes filling their skulls, they steeled themselves for another long stint of stumbling in the depths. But they didn't move for long. After a brief descent down a slight incline, they came into a short span of vein which broadened and seemed to give way up ahead. A black chamber loomed beyond the tunnel, and their lights threw wild beams off the slick surfaces of the stained, organic walls within. It was high-ceilinged, so much so they could not see its peak from within their hiding place in the adjoining tunnel, and its walls swept wide for 20 or 30 yards, giving the place the dimensions of a small arena in the labyrinth. Many other arteries opened up on this larger chamber across the way, and the whole place reverberated with the pumping bass of the heartbeat shaking the beast which enveloped them. I don't like anything about that, Stan muttered, so low the others hardly heard him over the noise. The others all agreed, their nervous apprehension not needing to be uttered aloud. They all froze on the brink, internally debating what to do, wishing to remain silent until one or the other settled on a plan of action for the crossing. All the while, their eyes scanned the rippling surface of the chamber in front of them, each second investing the deep dark of the pooled blood there with yet more danger. It was due to that silence that Luther heard the swishing in the liquid behind them in the tunnel. Almost simultaneously, he felt something unseen flit past his ankle in the wet bleak of the blood beneath him, just like the sensations he'd so often felt when cutting drains farther up the labyrinth, but larger. He spun, as did Soraya and Stan, all of them cursing the waist-deep swamp and the blindness it burdened them with as they did so. What they saw in the beams they cast that way were tiny, mostly bottle-cap-sized crustaceans or arthropods scuttling from the bloodline up the walls of the vein. Some were larger, around the size of a balled fist. There were thousands already, dripping ichor into the pool they'd left. They were seemingly eyeless and flat as pill bugs on the move, and yet flexed 2 needles or stingers in place of forward claws that glistened with an obscene clarity to Luther's wide eyes. Just as he realized their peril, he felt something scuttle up his pant leg beneath the surface, climbing its way up the soaked, bare flesh of his calf on sharp, cruel legs. No words or warnings were needed in the moment. Their guns couldn't do much against so many, and though Stan fired several deafening blasts at the ceiling as they wheeled and made for the large chamber, it made little impact on the horde. Worse still, there was no telling how thick the swarm was upon the floor of the veins. There was no time to cut an escape hatch out of the cartilage wall and into the open flesh of the dreamer beyond, nor was there time to double back up the vein and hope the hive of silent skitterers did not follow. All they could do was press forward, and hope against hope they survived the run. Running was a generous word to use for it, though. The thick, viscous nature of the waist-deep gore made retreat even more difficult than it would have been in water, and in places, the floor of the great chamber through which they ran fell away and forced them to struggle and swim in the blackness. Stan, laden as he was with the pack, lost his shotgun in the sightless depths during one of their plunges into the pools, and could not afford the luxury of diving back in to retrieve it. Abscesses and swollen pores in the fleshy ceiling were vomiting the things from above now, and not one of them had made it this far without having tiny chunks torn from their legs by unseen mouths below the bloodline. They were needled and prodded, and with each thrashing motion towards the exits across the way, Luther felt more and more lightheaded. It was as the pools shallowed out again and they neared the cluster of opposing tunnels into the deeper circulatory network that Soraya called to Stan, and tossed him his own rifle as a replacement for the lost weapon. The whispers were too loud, he said, and he didn't think he could last much longer. He waved the 2 of them on, wordlessly indicating he'd stay behind when he wheeled and plunged back into the liquid behind them. The big man's neck and face were swollen, and several of the mites tumbled from his scalp as he went. Luther started to protest, to double back and attempt to pull the man out, but Stan dragged him on. "He'll slow him down the only way he can," Stan called over the roar of the heart and the thrashing of Soraya in the water. "Don't waste the time he buys us." They stumbled back into the tunnel network, brushing mites from them in a clumsy tornado of wheeling limbs and scraping hands. Once the blood was only ankle deep, they fished the remainders out from under their clothes, never fully coming to a halt as they struggled to put more distance between themselves and the hive. Every once in a while, a fissure in the sturdy meat of the wall would vomit forth another line of mites, and they would sprint through the muck into the depths without heed for the effort and time they spent. Luther's stomach should be aflame, and his mind should be slumped beneath the weight of so many days without proper sleep, but he had lost track of time in the meat prison which encircled him. Notions like hunger and exhaustion were only filters through which the path ahead was seen. He couldn't tell if his lightheadedness was because of malnutrition, sleeplessness, or the venom of the mite's stingers, but it was inconsequential. Braying bellows stalked the halls with them, and Luther became convinced over time there were hunters in the tunnels as well, finally arrived to mop up the non-believers who had slipped into this hallowed maze. As they sloshed deeper and deeper into the labyrinth and wheeled down forks in the veins on instinct alone to avoid the ravenous sounds, all he could focus on was the ever louder thump of what had to be the heart, and the shrieking of the god through whom they ran. They were in the height of a run down a sloping passage when something moved far off down the tunnel before them, breaking the flow of their flashlight beams. It was horned, jagged, writhing, many-limbed and shrieking 1,000 echoing wails up the vein toward them. In the seconds they watched it before the shock died, it seemed almost like the thing Luther had spotted in the battered school way back on the outskirts of St. Louis, what seemed like a lifetime ago. Stan was better able to tolerate the soul-searing awfulness of the thing than he had been, for the older man dragged Luther by the arm down a steep fork in the path before them. They made it only 40 or 50 yards at a stumble before the ground gave way beneath the ichor, and they slid without purchase down a long chute, which widened and deepened beneath them all the while. They fell. As Luther lost his grip on his rifle, and his flashlight was abandoned in favor of the knife, he sank into the meat beneath him in vain attempts to slow his descent. He found himself truly blind and helpless, wholly at the mercy of the dreamer's voice. Luther lost track of how far or how long the fall was. He only knew in those moments that the dreamer was keening in his thoughts, shrill and forceful as it told him what he would do when he reached the end of the drop. He must find Stan in the dark and kill him, it said. He must relinquish himself, lest he lose all freedom to survive the foolish trip he'd so carelessly embarked upon. It would take great effort to find forgiveness, it said, but perhaps, with Herculean force, he could earn his keep. The words had to be spoken between the thunder of the heart, for it was so very loud now. Louder than thought, louder than life. Luther splashed into what felt like open water. He sloshed to the surface and gasped, thrashing as he realized the pool in which he bobbed was far too deep to stand in. He had to spit great gobs of congealed god blood from his mouth and wipe streams of the stuff from his eyes as he surfaced. But it was all in vain, for all he found beyond the thin shields of his clenched eyelids was blackness. Until the thud of the heartbeat sounded, and a dull, barely perceptible light hit the chamber. He swam towards it, gasping and squirming, expecting at each moment some unseen tendril or beast to grab him from below. Luther pulled himself onto a slick beach of stinking flesh. Again the pulse sounded, and again a dull light lit the titanic chamber in which he found himself, but he did not have time to truly orient himself. All he knew for certain in that second was that the room was massive even beyond the stomach above them, many miles across at least, and its core was a vast, flat island astride an ocean of trembling black blood. A call reached his ears, strained and distant. He rose upon shaking legs, trying desperately to focus on the cries for aid through the dreamer's thumping and shrieking. It took a few long and agonized minutes, but at last he found the source. Stan was laying further up the beach, having apparently fallen upon the flesh rather than in the liquid. His leg was badly broken, and he bled badly from the compound fracture he'd taken in the fall. His breaths were shallow, and it occurred to Luther he might well have broken ribs in the impact. He didn't speculate aloud, though. He merely removed Stan's pack at his request, and made the man comfortable as he could upon the alien ground. "Take the stake and the hammer from in there," Stan told him. "Take 'em and go. Just leave me here. I can't move the way I am." Luther scrambled to obey, the motions made all the more desperate by the shrill dives of several shrieking shapes into the black sea beyond the shore. He felt more than saw as the heavy stake found his hand, and the hefty sledge his other. He rose on shaky legs, preparing to run, waiting for the pulse to bring light to the chamber once more. "You're not so soft now," Stan called after him as he ran. "Kill it. It knows you're coming. It's scared. Godslayer." Stan almost laughed the final words, but they were wholly serious. Luther did him the courtesy of not pausing to say goodbye, of not lingering on the brink of the island to put his thoughts in order. There was no time to think. He grabbed hold of Stan's final calls after him in the dark, and acted on them. Luther's run was blind and treacherous, lit only every 8 or 10 seconds by the sluggish thumps of the heart. At first he thought he must be near the thing, but as he chewed tripping and panting through a mile of alien terrain towards what had to be the center of the vast chamber about him, he realized he was on it. It simply looked nothing like any heart he'd ever seen before. He fled across a great membrane or pad of pale meat which squished and sank under his boots. It was studded with a webbed network of black blood vessels that thrummed with each tightened beat, and the flesh juddered beneath him like ground under bombardment with each titan pump. Mighty rings of rough, ridged nodes with the hard consistency of bone jutted up out of the membrane in equally spaced rows, and they gleamed with a dull, cold glow each time the heart loosed its flow of wicked blood. They grew taller as he went farther from the shore, and before long, Luther was running through a veritable forest of the spiny protrusions, his eyes aching each time the glow surrounded him, and his progress slowing each time the dark closed back in upon him in the osseous copse of awful growths. Pursuers were on the membrane now, but they all sounded distant. Perhaps they were. Luther chose to think it was the dreamer's volume that made them seem far away, and he flew as if the bleating of unseen hunters was right upon his heels. Every step brought the dreamer's shrill calls to a more fevered desperation, and made Luther more certain he was at the edge of finding what all of them, had sought for so long. It was as the voice grew loudest, as he teetered on the cusp of sanity beneath the berating blows of that eternal voice which pounded in his skull, that he saw it. There was a clearing in the center of the forest of growths, and in its center, at the core of a web of veins so thick they colored the ground a deep onyx, was a massive, writhing, jet-black organ in the shape of a mushroom's head. It rumbled like the head of a drum, and the capillary web which surrounded it surged in time with the deafening beats it loosed upon them. Luther approached, stake out before him like a spear. It glimmered in the low light brought forth by the pumping blood. Silver, he knew, likely a solid spine of it. Heavy as iron, but far more pliable. Still, soft as the metal was, it was more than enough to pierce the gelatinous thing which pulsed at his feet. Luther planted the razor-sharp spine in the center of the strange heart's stranger core, and watched as the tender skin of the organ flinched and writhed at its touch like a slug beneath a rain of salt. He grit his teeth as the speech of the thing from beyond the stars, which had fancied itself a god, lost track of words, and waxed into screaming. For a long second, he thought maybe that was enough, that his ears would bleed, and he might collapse in a heap upon the peak of the thing he'd sought to kill. But Stan's last call came back to him, joining the words of Aram as he pried his lids open and forced himself to look down upon his prey, in spite of the agony the screams birthed in him. He gripped tight at the stake with one hand, slid it into the softest layers of skin upon the heart's wretched core, and took up the sledge in his trembling free hand. He would give it a few strikes to plant it, then go two-handed until he could drive it no deeper. It was over. Luther hoisted his hammer up above him, blind to any pain save that which he was about to inflict. In sync with the last raucous thump of the heart beneath him, he brought it crashing down, the clang of the impact lost amidst the chorus of a million screaming mouths. "Godslayer," he repeated aloud to himself, and to the thing which shrieked beneath his feet.